All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much again for joining our webinar today, Managing Privacy by Design in Modern Technologies. And today, we're going to be focusing on privacy by design, and we're going to be covering very practical steps for data protection compliance officers or other people who are responsible for ensuring that the organization's products and services are compliant with the relevant data protection laws. And we're going to be showing, using very practical terms and very practical illustrations to ensure that everyone understands what data privacy by design is and can get away from this webinar being able to implement them effectively in their own organizations. To help us do that today, we have a very expert panel who I'm going to just call on to introduce themselves. My name is Kunbi. I work at Data Privacy Advisory Service as a data privacy officer. And if we could have Ralph introduce himself, that would be very great.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name's Ralph O'Brien, and I always start this by, standing up at Alcoholics Anonymous and saying, this is my 25th year in data protection. So yeah, with 2.5 decades of experience helping organizations, both large and small, to develop privacy programs and make sure that they're in a very, very good place. It's interesting that Kunbi was talking about compliance, so I think we'll come back to that word in a minute. But look forward to speaking to you while I hand over to Natalie.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ralph. Good morning, everybody. I am Natalie, or just Nat would be absolutely fine. I also work for DPAS and I manage our consultancy team. So not quite as many years under my belt as Ralph, but a good breadth and depth given the range of services we do at DPAS.
Thank you very much, Ralph and Nat. We're going to move now to an overview of what exactly privacy by design is. And you'll see here the principles that together make up privacy by design. And I'm just going to ask the panelists, our expert panelists, to give us an overview, of what exactly privacy by design is and why it's important for organizations. So could we start with you, Ralph, please?
Yeah, I mean, these principles are actually, credit where credit's due, created by a lady called Anne Cavoukian in the 90s, who was a privacy commissioner in Ontario, in Canada. So these are not exactly new. And, it was really interesting because the ICO a couple of days ago put out some guidance on pets and privacy enhancing technologies, with a recommendation that organizations start to adopt these pets within the next 5 years. Now, that's amused me because obviously within our current law, the UK GDPR, there is a requirement to have privacy by design, and there always has been a requirement to have privacy by design. So, I think if you're an organization, I wouldn't be waiting 5 years, but really these principles are about pulling data protection, not really as a reactive legal compliance problem. And I think a lot of organizations do look at it that way. I think if you're a data protection officer and you've had a technology put in front of you and said, hey, we've bought this, go away and do a DPIA on it, you're probably going to have been frustrated at some point at your lack of ability to make any change, your lack of ability to introduce, common sense controls that's going to protect people. So for me, privacy by design, realistically, is about moving data protection away from a sort of a reactive legal paperwork process and moving it closer to the design and technology aspects. So when we're onboarding new products, new services, new solutions, new vendors, making sure that we add in data protection and protection from harm for individuals as functionality and features that add benefit rather than take away.
Thank you very much, Ralph. And I'm going to ask Nat now on the subject of being proactive rather than reactive. And what does that mean for you, for clients whom you advise? How do you integrate that into their design processes for their products and services?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Kunbi. I think really, really broad question. One of the biggest challenges I think we see is the cultural side of things and the appetite. And as Ralph says, people seeing this as a compliance issue. We all know it's a compliance issue. The law stipulates, we're obligated to take this approach, but My aim when I'm dealing with my clients and for DPAS is to see people, to get clients to see the benefits beyond compliance. So, you know, having this as embedded into your sort of business as usual, it's there in those early decision-making conversations. It is the default setting, you know, how do we protect the data? How do we protect the data subject? Getting people to understand why that is important, not just for compliance, but the wider issues and what they can potentially benefit from by doing it so early on.
Great, that makes a lot of sense. And clearly that's the entire point of it being by design. As the name implies, the goal is to ensure that it's embedded right into the actual creation of the product or service. So we've covered being proactive and not reactive. We've covered embedding it into the design. What is the other element, which says making privacy the default setting? How have you helped, have you seen that in good practice in the wild, so to speak, Ralph?
Well, I've seen plenty of bad practice in the wild, that's for certain. I think it's really interesting. There's almost a deceptive design practice. Well, we call these sort of good privacy patterns, but there's actually deceptive design practices, which is almost the opposite. And one of the things we've always called privacy zuckering, which is this idea of, named after the wonderful eponymous Mark Zuckerberg, of course, and that's always been about sort of complex privacy settings. I mean, imagine you're logging into a platform like Facebook or Twitter or something like that for the first time. And, you know, if you're smart, if you're a privacy professional or somebody who cares about their personal data, you're probably going to spend some time in the settings, understanding and spending a bit of time trying to create a more private, tailored experience. So you've got some complex privacy settings that you can change. But really, privacy as a default should be the opposite of that. Privacy by the default should be that when an individual logs onto that products and services for the first time, everything is protected. Why should it be on the individual to have to go into the technology and change everything from open to closed? Isn't it far safer for everything to start off closed and for them to have to switch it to open, right? And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about privacy as the default. It's adding functionality and features that enable a good user experience more than anything else.
Thank you very much, Ralph. And we're going to have Nat just give us her own perspective on that question of full functionality, right? Because even though it's implied in making privacy the default setting, like Ralph has explained, what exactly does it mean to ensure that privacy by design still facilitates the full functionality of your product or service, as well as facilitating visibility and transparency for the people who are using your product and services? How does that work for people whom you advise? Nat?
So really different depending on the client. I think to sort of echo some of what Ralph said kind of bleeds into this as a wider concept of that default thing. That, what can we implement, what can we use that benefits the client? Of course, clients with enormous data sets, have potentially more options. There is easier routes, if you like, than hospitals, for example, or people with particularly sensitive special category data. I think the really important thing here to echo across all of these things, we can break them down into individual things, sure, but they all have the same underpinning principle. And the key one here for me is from what Ralph said about the default and people having choice, leads into the sort of visibility and transparency as well, that people need to understand what the concept of this is and what we're trying to achieve. And so that comes also back around to let's give them choice, and that choice that they have should be transparent. They should have full control over their settings. Privacy settings is so Ralph just said, the complexity behind social media in particular. Privacy settings, you'll go on and there's 20 different toggles you can turn on and off that are full of legalese that nobody really knows what it is that they're turning on or turning off. So you can have the best functionality, the best default settings, all of the ideas might be there, but actually the execution is really, really important, and the individuals that need to be able to benefit from that functionality in those default settings need to understand what choices they have.
I'll also jump in on that point of full functionality. I think in a lot of organizations, when they look at data protection as some sort of horrible cost, I think businesses have this idea that we're trying to shut them down, right? That that privacy is the most important thing in the world and you can't have both. And, so if you're going to have privacy, you can't have a kick-ass social media platform, or you can't have, we're often described as the brakes on the car. Well, my point of view is if you don't have good brakes, you can't go fast in safety, right? So for me, it's about not taking away from the business, not being seen as the no person. And, when I come back to my desk and I find somebody sitting there and they're telling me that the system's already been launched, or they came to me for approval and they came to me because far later than they should have done, I kind of said, well, why didn't you come to me earlier? And they say, well, it's because I thought you were going to say no. And then you kind of have to look at yourself in a mirror as a data protection professional, and you kind of think, well, am I the no person? Am I the person who's wandering around hitting people with a no bat, stopping the business from operating? So for me, getting in early allows you to add functionality. It allows you to have data protection not against the functionality, but actually as the functionality of the product. I mean, what's easier? You manually answering a subject access request, or telling the individual, log on and press a button? Right.
I think you touched on a really good point there as well, Ralph, about, and I remember having this conversation with you before and webinars, talks that you've done about not being that no person, and that is how we're perceived often. I think there is an element of that that's down to training. The individuals in what, it's great, we can sit as DPOs or as IG managers, or, working in data protection directly, that maybe understand the benefits of this slightly more. But it's really important actually that we need to communicate that thing more to wider workforces. Often people that have got these ideas are tech developers, your IT department. They don't necessarily understand the implications of data protection or how it affects what they're trying to do. So they automatically, their default is that we are the no. They're the guys that are going to say you can't do it, you can't do that. So actually there's probably quite a large awareness piece and a training piece that is really important to underpin all of these things. The more people we can get on board, and I know we're going to come onto it a little bit more later on, but getting that buy-in, not just from your senior leadership team, but from the guys that are building this functionality and the people that are implementing it, so they understand how they can use it to improve what they're doing as well. And eventually, hopefully, we all live together as a happy family, and it all goes.
A happy little commune. A good friend of mine, privacy luminary Stuart Room, he says we're all on a journey to code, and I think that's a fascinating concept. That actually, rather than coming in later, is once the product and service has already been delivered or already been bought, and you end up papering over the cracks with a DPAA or putting in compliance issues later on. I do believe, the closer we can get to the technology, the closer we can get to the engineers, the closer we can get to the requirement statements, the earlier we can get involved, the more we have the ability to influence the entire life cycle, from end to end, from collection to disposal. And then that gives us much more control and ability to contribute. And then, as I said, then it becomes not about data protection against the functionality of the product, but data protection becomes part of the functionality of the product or service that you're trying to implement.
Yeah, thank you both very much. And I think that's a very important point that speaks to how you view data protection and privacy in your organization. And my question is going to be to the audience. Have you seen the advertisements that have been put out very recently by Apple in particular, as well as Samsung? So these are huge companies, $1 trillion companies, and they have decided to begin marketing the privacy features of their products as a value add to customers. Now, how true that is in practice, obviously, is still an open question, but it's clear that for many users today, privacy and data protection is something that they prioritize when selecting what products and services to go for in any marketplace. And my question now, we've touched on almost all of the elements of the principles of privacy by design, and we just need to touch on the issues of what exactly it means when we say end-to-end security. So to Ralph now, I'd say, how do you ensure end-to-end security and full lifecycle protection when you're implementing privacy by design?
Well, and I'm sure Nat, as a consultant as well, you know, the first thing we do when we go into any customer is we break down their data flows. Yeah, we understand the flows of personal data from collection to disposal, from cradle to grave, right? Because at the end of the day, that's when the law applies, when you're collecting personal data, and it applies all the way through to disposal. So if I was to draw a sort of a line or a flow chart starting from the individual and ending up in a bin or a big archive somewhere, sort of going across the page, and then I'd be looking at the principles of data protection and the principles of privacy by design almost coming down the page, right? And where they intersect is our control points. Where they intersect is our control points. So it's understanding the flow of data. And, you know, we've all been working on projects where we've looked at things like ropers and data inventories, and we know what hard work that is, but sometimes you can conceptualize a product or a service, you know, a high level. What does an organization do? They've got some staff, so they collect recruitment data all the way through to firing or retiring the staff at the other end. They tell people about what they do, so they're going to be doing some marketing, so we're going to be collecting some data or collecting some leads or some prospects. And we're going to be seeing that all the way through to successful customers or people who aren't. And then we're going to be delivering what we deliver. Now, that could be one thing, it could be 1,000 things. It depends on the nature and size of your company. But again, you know, if that involves personal data, there'll be a point of collection, there'll be some use of that data, there'll be some storage of that data, there'll be some retention and reuse of that data, all the way through to, you know, archiving and deletion and records management on that other end. So once we identify those data flows and we work out where our principles intersect with them, that's going to give us the ability to work out what harm that could cause the individual, and then ultimately suggest controls that can protect the individual. And I think a lot of data protection and privacy by design for me is having a playbook in your back pocket, having common solutions for common problems. So you're not just coming at people with problems, you're coming at people with solutions. And it's funny this says end-to-end security, because it was end-to-end everything, but I think we have to work a lot better, as Nat said, as a happy family with our security colleagues who are often there first. We talk about getting in early in the design stage. Well, often security is there before we are, you know, when we're taking on a new vendor and a new product. So my big suggestion to data protection individuals is, rather than timely and adding new interventions, you utilize the interventions that your security divisions are already taking, and leapfrog as a sort of a wider information governance initiative.
Thank you very much, Ralph. And we're going to move to...
I'm just going to quickly add on to Kunbi. I'm sorry, I know Ralph and I are going to hijack the lovely running order. But I just want to add, Ralph, I think you made a great point there. Security are often there before we are. And I think there is this societal misconception. We start talking about security arrangements, data protection as a phrase in itself. And the default is, you know, Jason Bourne running down a train, protecting the world's secrets in a briefcase, and, oh, it's going to cost all of this money and we need all of these expertise. We need to remember that this is necessary, proportionate, what's relevant. That actually securing data on an end-to-end life cycle doesn't have to be this super complex, super expensive solution. For some people, it's a relatively simple implementation, and actually they only need to take you know, relatively low-level steps. So remembering that actually all of these things that we're discussing are so tailored and are so different, sort of case by case for different organizations. What's right for one organization may not be right for your organization.
That's where I was disappointed with the ICO PETS guidance on the last couple of days, actually, because it spoke about this sort of future state of technology, call it PETS version 2 in the future, where you have homomorphic encryption and quantum computing, and there was all these sexy, you know, terms, synthetic data and machine learning, where to me privacy by design is a lot more basic than that. It's actually about you know, things like good access control, separating out your user groups, understanding how much data you're going to collect. I mean, you know, the old-fashioned principles that have been there since, you know, 1980 and before. And to have the ICO talking about pets as this sort of futuristic tech, I found quite disappointing personally.
Yeah, I agree. Do you know, I would like to say, where pets are concerned, I have a relatively good handle on them as a theory and the commonly used pets and what we use them for. But I was also quite taken aback by some of the things that were in the guidance that we've obviously only just sort of started to see recently be published. Yeah, like you say, it's that's not relevant to everyone. And I think sometimes that kind of publication actually is quite damaging, especially to that cultural thing that we're saying. We're trying to get people on board, trying to get the sort of wider team to understand that this isn't a hurdle all the time. We can make this work. So I know for sure that I probably won't be circulating the guidance to my clients that are maybe less in the know, that's for sure.
True enough.
Yes. On the subject of the privacy enhancing technologies, this discussion has reminded me, and also based on what Nat has said about needing to be a happy family with tech and security in your organizations, it reminds me of our last webinar. So we had from Dudley Council, we had the DPO Lewis, and he talked to us about how there was sort of a technology arms race going on while they were trying to build out the infrastructure to use for their CCTV project. And it seemed like the tech people were wanting to go for the newest, latest, greatest, most shiny, tech stuff, while he, on the other hand, needed to sort of temper that to bring them in toward considering privacy as well. And that has made me think now that privacy clearly can be a force for good or evil in quote when it comes to privacy. And that's where privacy enhancing technology rather, and that's where privacy enhancing technologies come into play. So can we get an overview, Ralph, please, on what exactly do you think privacy enhancing technologies are? I know you've touched on this a bit, but if we could get some examples, some practical applications, and how can they help with privacy by design?
Yeah, so pets, I'm sure it's not lost on anyone. I'm surprised you haven't got a picture of a dog or a cat on this, or a hamster of some kind. On not the fluffy things we feed. There should be a black Labrador around here somewhere. But in this terminology, in fact, you could almost split them into two. There are privacy enhancing technologies and almost privacy enabling technologies. I'm sure it won't be lost on anybody in the data protection world that there are a number of companies out there that claim to have the silver bullet, right? There are a number of companies out there that will provide tools that will support you. And I think they come in two types. The first set of tools are the tools marketed specifically to privacy professionals. So, these are the ones that are going to assist you to automate your job and make your job easier as you're dealing in a large organization at scale. Not going to work for everybody. As a small organization, you're probably unlikely to need a technology tool outside of an Excel spreadsheet, right? But if you're a large corporate organization and you've got thousands of people all over the globe and processes, automation might help with creating a data inventory or understanding where your data is, or performing assessments or surveys on your products or services or vendors. So there's a number of tools out there, and I'm sure you'll know the names and the people who have marketed to you who will provide tools for the data protection professional to make their job easier and automate at scale. That's one side of it. And they're the ones we sort of use to manage our data protection or manage our rights requests or manage our data inventories. We can flip over to the other side of it, which is more to do with the data, more to do with the tools that we give the individual, and that could be front-end user experience or back-end with the data itself, to enable us to manage data protection in practice. And they could be anything from security tools, which are going to be stuff that allow you to protect your confidentiality, integrity, and availability, access control, encryption, all of those good stuff that protects our data from a sort of a confidentiality and a security point of view. Or they could be things that enable rights requests within a tool or a product or a service. They could be things that enable data control. I do want to disclose this. I don't want to disclose this. I want this to be public. I want this to be private. Or they could be stuff that actually play with the data themselves. So add aggregations so that you can select groups of people rather than individuals. Things that add noise to the data to make it harder to identify individuals. And this is when we start to get into the more high concept, high technology tools that allow sort of data scientists to play with data without revealing the identity of individuals. For most of us, we're not going to play in that pool, unless we're a researcher or a data scientist or a technology, we're not going to be using those statistical data tools. We're going to be using the more common sense tools like, encryption and access control, and, where is the data and how connected is it, and, what's the infrastructure behind it going to look like. So I don't want to drown anyone in technology here, but pets are a complete range. It's really just a label we put on anything that enables us to put in those data protection principles of minimization and separation and purpose limitation on a more technological level.
Thank you very much, Ralph. That's a very clear explanation of what exactly pets are. Now, we're all very clear that they are not, big, fluffy, nice animals, but, a wide range of technologies that can have, different purposes depending on what an organization needs. So the fact that there's such a wide range of them is a good thing, because it means that, there's a larger menu to select from, so to speak, to suit exactly what your organization needs. It does also mean, conversely, that there can be some sort of decision paralysis. Sometimes it can be difficult to determine exactly what you need, what suits your organization. And that's where Nat is going to come in and give us an overview of what organizations will need to consider when selecting what pets to implement and how exactly to go about that. And if anyone has a question, please be aware that you can send your questions in via the Q&A function, and we'll just answer them in the course of the webinar. Thank you. So Nat, please.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Kunbi. Yeah, great question. Where do you start? As Ralph just explained, it's a big pool. I think the obvious first steps are we're looking at a risk-based approach. So we're going to start looking at the standard compliance documents that you're going to hear DPOs talking about all of the time, DPIAs, so on and so forth. But really the underpinning thing is, what are you trying to protect from? So what data are we protecting? What are you trying to protect it from? What threat intelligence do you have? What are your biggest risks? How many moving cogs do we have in this process? What's the life cycle? As Ralph said, what's the flow of this data? Are we talking about a particular process? Are we talking about a system, a particular data set? There's so many small moving parts, if you like. The obvious is to build in the more simple functionality first. We all have, I don't think that there's any value in me giving you a big speech about appropriate access controls, appropriate passwords, firewalls, antivirus systems. Most people are familiar with a VPN these days even. But starting to think about even the smallest of things can have really significant input or impact. That having access controls on your folders. I don't know how many organizations we've audited or gone in to do some sort of gap analysis, shared drives with folders that are available to everybody because no one's ever set up the access controls for them. Those small things are really a great starting point. Segmenting data, does this need to be there? Of course, we have those obvious GDPR principles as well. Do we need to keep all this? Do we need to keep it for that long? Did we need to collect it in the first place? So the principles are the obvious place to start. Think about your risk appetite. Think about what your threats are and understanding the landscape that you work in. And then there is the more structured things such as data protection impact assessments, which will analyze and assess that specific risk to the process. But there's probably quite a big thought piece before that of really understanding the environment that you're in and the risks associated with it.
Thank you very much, Nat. And I'm just going to pose the same question to Ralph. how do you advise organizations to proceed with selecting what PETs to implement? And yeah, what processes do you believe that they should be conducted?
Yeah, well, I think, again, you've got to start with yourself. You've got to convert yourself a little bit. It's okay walking in with all this theoretical GDPR and Data Protection Act and PECR knowledge. But unless you understand a little bit about the organization, their business goals and the technology that they employ, that's going to be, you're going to struggle to relate all that legal stuff to the actual operational business process, right? So you've got to understand the business and the environment. If you suggest anything that's going to get in the way of their business goals, you're going to be on a hiding to nothing, right? So you've got to find a more complementary way to support their goals. And that's can be quite interesting depending on the environment that you're in. So in terms of a process, I would start off by saying, identify your insertion points. And what I mean by insertion points is where you want to get in early, right? So in any organization, there's going to be probably a process for taking on new vendors, new suppliers, new third parties. There's a good insertion point because you're going to have to advise there. New projects, new services, new solutions, you probably have to insert yourself there. New IT systems or changes to existing IT systems. So you're going to have to find those insertion points, perhaps talk to your security divisions, as I said, when they're carrying out their sort of due diligence before a new product or service is onboarded, and make sure you're in early. And then, as Nat said, you can carry out things like DPAAs and understand the threat model. How can this hurt in the individuals? I've always liked the Daniel Salon's taxonomy. He's actually an American academic, but he came up with sort of a taxonomy of privacy harms. And what that has always enabled me to do is go through a new piece of technology and go, well, could it hurt someone like this? Could it hurt somebody like this? Could it hurt somebody like this? What would the impact and likelihood be on the individual? Putting the individual back at the heart of what you're going to do. And then again, it's about being the solution person, not the problem person. So what we're going to recommend at this point is a series of features and functionality. Yeah, a series of features and functionality that, we say, these are the risks, and then have in your back pocket, this is what I call our privacy playbook, right? This is our go-to encryption solution. This is our go-to anonymization or pseudonymization solution. This is our go-to transparency solution. This is our go-to rights request solution. So you can implement those as controls in a way that will solve the common problems with common solutions. Yeah, the common problems with common solutions. And in a way, that's what I think data protection is going to end up with. It's going to be finding those technologies that work for you as an organization that you can input and amend to your new products and solution that's going to automate, because our biggest problem in modern society is scale. I remember going back to the late 90s and, I was dealing with a rack of 100 records on paper. Now, I was dealing with a client the other day and they told me they had a 0.01 error rate. And you could say, that's amazing, 0.01 error rate. No one's ever going to be problematic. And if I was still looking at my rack of 100 paper-based records, 0.01, yeah, no one's going to be affected. But this particular client had 4 billion images in their database. So I'm not going to do the maths for you, but 4 billion times 0.01 is actually still a significant number of individuals. So to me, what's changed is not so much the problem, but the scale. And technology allows replication at scale. It allows error at scale. It allows harm at scale, but also great benefit at scale. So for me, I'm going to suggest that if technology is the problem, it's also going to be the solution. So if we can get in there and start to address early and have this playbook in our hands of technologies, almost turnkey solutions, if X, then Y, that's going to enable us to be a solution for the organization and a value add and a benefit for the organization rather than a reactive cost who hits the brakes all the time.
And that's the way the world's going, right? Now it's time to get ahead of the game, so to speak, that, whether you like it or not, whether it's in 12 months, 2 years, 5, 10 years down the line, technology is going to be almost compulsory to some extent. You're not going to have a lot of choice. So, understand it, use it to your benefit, get in there early now, and reap reap what you sow, reap the rewards in a few years.
And that's an interesting point about notice and choice. I mean, my 91-year-old grandmother, who's not technologically savvy, actually has a real trouble already interacting with today's modern services, because they went from, hey, wouldn't it be a good idea if we technologically enabled our services, to now they're all technology enabled. You kind of forget about the old manual versions, and then certain people who are not technologically savvy or haven't grown up with technology are left at a disadvantage. I mean, it's really interesting. I was dealing with a phone company the other day on her behalf, who wanted to charge her because she didn't have an email address to send an electronic bill to. So they were like, well, if you want a paper bill, that'll be an extra charge. And I thought that was a really interesting element, whereby technology had kind of moved on to the point where it was so expected now that you were disadvantaged if you weren't a technology user.
For sure. I think that's, I recently updated my car insurance. If I did it over the phone, I paid an admin fee. You do it online, you don't pay the admin fee.
And you do automated decision making then, of course.
Well, yeah, had I of course, read the privacy notice first. Then also, I don't know now if anyone has experienced it. It's becoming more and more prevalent that organisations now offer WhatsApp as a form of communication. And those shifts that we're talking about have happened pretty quickly, really. So where is that going to put us? We know there's this big buzz around AI. We know that there's lots of people implementing AI in some way, shape, or form. That's going to continue ultimately. We're effectively streamlining the processes that we already have. So, yeah, I think it goes without saying that now is the time to get on the horse, if you like, and get ahead of the game.
Yeah, and technology is getting good. I mean, I personally failed the Turing test the other day. If you're not aware of the Turing test, to anyone who's listening, it was proposed by Alan Turing, the father of the modern computer. Those people who've seen the Bletchley Park films will know he had a go at cracking the Enigma code in World War II. But to do so, he invented the computer, and he actually was really interested in artificial intelligence. And he came up with his test that said, if you put a computer in another room and a human being talks to it through a text interface or something like that, if that person can't tell they're talking to a computer, computers have passed the Turing test and we've got AI. Now, the other day, I was on a website and a chat bot popped up in the bottom right-hand corner and it said, hello, I'm Brian. And I was like, hi, Brian. And I was talking to this chat bot to get what I wanted. And then after about 5 or 6 measures, it says, great, I'll hand you over to a human to help you. And I'm like, ah! So either they've passed the Turing test or I failed it. I don't know which one. But it was. But you are right. We are getting to the stage where that technology is pervasive because we're having to deal with things at volume and scale, which also means errors are replicated at scale as well. So, as I said, if technology is the problem, it can also be the solution. There's actually kind of 8 things that pets do, roughly. You can break them down into 2 groups of 4. And so there's what we call a process-orientated strategy. And there's what we call a data-orientated strategy. So there's 4 things you can do with a process for the individual, 4 things you can do for the data at the back end. I've been working a lot with the Operational Institute of Privacy by Design, R. Jason Cronk, who does some great work. They put up a couple of great books, actually. And he basically says on the process side of things, well, you can inform people. So good privacy notices, having pop-ups, and that, by the way, informing, I don't just mean privacy policies, privacy notices. I mean, little pop-ups throughout the process, like keeping people aware, offering them choices at the right time within the process, not just a privacy notice that no one reads. Offering them good controls, so not the complex dashboards necessarily, but real meaningful choices about where their data ends up. You could demonstrate. You can have a badge or incentivize people to do things the right way. And then obviously you can enforce when things go wrong. So that means kicking people off the platform if they're found to be doing nasty things, or people who don't comply, you can get rid of. So on the process, you can inform, control, demonstrate, and enforce. And then there's on the data side, this is almost the back end side. And the 4 words there are hide. So encrypting or putting in good access control to separate groups of people, perhaps. Aggregate. So taking decisions not on the individual level, but on wider groups. Minimize, we're all familiar with that from the data protection principles. Don't collect it, you don't have the risk of harm, right? Or separating out individuals. So, you know, for most of us, we might have staff members, we might have a set of customers, a set of suppliers, a set of staff. How do we separate out those groups, minimize the contact and the connections? So on the process, you've got inform, control, demonstrate, enforce. On the data side, you've got hide, aggregate, minimize, and separate. So I find by just putting those 8 words on the back end of a DPAA, those 8 words, you know, how can I inform? How can I control? How can I demonstrate? How can I enforce? How can I hide? How can I aggregate? How can I minimize? How can I separate? A lot of privacy by design for me will be generated from just using those 8 words. And I've started to lecture and I do apologize. Over to you, Matt.
All right, thank you very much, Ralph. That's very helpful. I mean, I'm sure that everyone knows exactly and has a clear picture of exactly what to and how exactly to choose and implement PETs. And what has stuck out to me because of this discussion is what you said at the very beginning, that the perception that PETs are a newfangled invention is completely wrong. What they are essentially is just a structuring of the same data protection principles that we all are aware of and that have been in the laws for decades, literally. And that then raises the same problems that, you know, data protection practitioners have had for the same length of time, which is the challenges that they face in getting their organizations to implement this effectively, as well as the challenges that they face even as data protection officers trying to implement specific initiatives. So I'm going to ask Nat, what sorts of challenges do you believe that you know, DPOs or other people who are responsible for this in the organizations typically face, and you know, what are your tips on how they can overcome them? And then we're going to have Ralph share his perspective on that as well.
Yeah, great question. I think we've touched on a couple of these things. The first and the most obvious one is that we're seen as a hurdle and we're brought into these conversations far too late. I've lost count of the amount of times where I've received a DPIA saying, this goes live tomorrow, can you sign it off, please? And then you almost perpetuate that cycle because you look like you're the one saying no, but actually, had you been invited to that conversation earlier, the situation would be very different. Potentially even a step before that, and something that we see quite frequently now, and anybody that also attended our previous CCTV webinar, it's an ongoing theme of communication. And we touched on this earlier with the amount of different individuals that are involved in implementation of security measures, particularly, especially when we're talking about technical or IT security measures, PETs, this kind of idea, that there isn't always the best communication between those departments and your DPO or whichever, you know, your data protection lead or the team that you have in-house. So one of the key things is getting the conversation going in the first place, getting the team that you work with to understand that as that data protection lead, you're not there to say no, actually you can benefit them. And the easiest way to do that is exactly that. You know, they need to see what value you bring to the table. For some organizations, they will value finance, you know, and most organizations. So, you know, point out that you might be able to save them money rather than cost them money. You know, the tech arms race, as Lewis previously put it, you know, we don't have to get caught up in that. Again, cost saving exercise. There is a variety of customer advantages that you could mention. So it's about getting that decision maker, you know, where it benefits them. Finance is a big one, right, for all of us. If you ever deal with sort of SLT directors, CEOs, they want to do what they can as well as they can for as cheap as they can. So if you can go in and say, okay, look, we need to implement this tool, or we need to do it this way, it's potentially going to save you this much money and it's going to benefit you in all of these ways. They're the conversations that they want to have. Open up that communication, get people in a room. You know, the more of the conversation you can have about it, the more people that are going to fight your corner too. One of the key problems that I see over and over again is people are just not aware that things need doing. They aren't aware that they should have appropriate security arrangements. They think changing their password every 90 days is good enough. You know, they don't realize that access controls are considered things that actually are thought through. They just assume that their management can see more things than they can, because that's how it's always been. So really getting that buy-in and having people understand the message that we're trying to get across and the benefits of doing it. Generally speaking, once people understand the upside, you know, how we can help and the point of doing this and the benefits, the things that they can do better, they're on board. But we need to get everyone in a room, or, you know, everyone on a call or whatever the medium might be, to have that conversation in the first place. Oh, we've lost you, Kunbi. I can see you talking.
I think you're on mute, Taddy.
Yes, thank you very much, Nat. So I just moved this to the next slide because you know, very brilliantly taking us to the next stage, which is talking about how in practice, you know, the people element is a very crucial one to be able to deliver privacy by design. And so for Ralph, I'm sure you're going to tell us what you think the greatest challenges are. If you could also touch on that people aspect, perhaps from the perspective of getting management buy-in and how to, you know, deploy that effectively.
Yeah, I mean, well, if I had the silver bullet here, I'd, you know, I probably wouldn't be on this webinar. I'd be on a Caribbean island somewhere. But you know, changing attitudes is always going to be one of the more difficult things. And I think it's interesting. I was looking at a risk register the other day, and they said risk data protection on it. And I thought that was really interesting, because the management had put data protection as the risk. And I think that's how we sold it for a long time. We said there is a risk you will be fined. There is a risk you'll be penalized. And I thought about it and said, no, data protection isn't your risk. Data protection is your solution. Data protection is actually how you should be managing your risks. And so it's a really interesting journey to get somebody, oh God, I said the word journey, to get somebody from looking at data protection as this horrible legal compliance issue that's out to get your business, from a potential solution that's going to win you business, right? That's going to bring you competitive advantage and customer satisfaction and good user experience. And I think in a way that's up to us. That's up to us as individuals, right? And I think we've been selling ourselves wrong. We've been selling ourselves as you know, do what we say or else bad things will happen to you. That's blackmail, right? And I don't think that's what we're paid for, you know. And you know, and how do we then evaluate our own success? Well, the management comes to us at the end of the year and go, oh, we didn't get fined this year. Well, great, no unicorns got past my castle walls, you know. You know, I don't think there's a likelihood in today's climate with our current information commissioner for a lot of organizations, you're going to be targeted for a financial penalty. So for me, it's about rebranding ourselves, reskilling ourselves, you know, perhaps becoming more technology. There's a great question in the questions that I just answered via text, actually, that somebody says, you know, is privacy likely to go the way of security and have more specialized roles? And we're kind of actually already seeing that. You know, I was at an IAPP conference last year, and it actually had a privacy engineering track. So that means privacy engineers exist. You know, I think we, but for not every organization is going to be able to afford or even want a privacy engineer. So, you know, so yes, they're going to be more narrow fields and more specialist fields we can get into. But for some of us who are more generalists, we're going to have to expand our worldview away from papering over the cracks, away from designing policies and procedures and privacy notices, onto how do we get into the technology early and add features and functionality. And that is a very different role than traditionally we have been employed as a privacy professional. And I've certainly had to reskill myself. Right, I've certainly had to reskill myself. You know, I'm lucky that I come from a technology background, but I've certainly had to reskill myself from a legal compliance professional, from an auditor, if you like, to a technology professional. And that may not sit well with everybody. There will be roles for everybody, don't worry. But yeah, so being able to put forward cogent discussions to the management board about the benefits of good proactive features and functionality is going to be a much better message to send across than talking about the negatives of non-compliance.
Thank you very much, Ralph.
I think it's worth mentioning as well that we've talked about two real extremes of, we're talking about basic access controls and standard computer security arrangements, and then the real extreme of these new technologies that, as we said, Ralph and you highlighted, that actually most organisations won't ever get to the state of needing to implement. But there's other solutions in the middle that actually can be beneficial in lots of ways. You don't need to have everything, doesn't all need to be all singing or dancing. There's even privacy management software can be hugely beneficial for streamlining processes. You can think outside the box. There's no rule book as such for this. It's an idea. Yes, the UK GDPR says that we should implement this as a standard, but that standard is that we should consider data protection in everything that we do. We should embed it in as from conception. There's no you should do X, Y, and Z. So this is going to look different for everybody. Nobody's right nor wrong in the way that they're implementing it. Some people's management may benefit from something that somebody else's doesn't. I think it's really important that we reiterate that actually this is such a broad area that everybody's solution can be very different, and it doesn't mean anybody's wrong.
There's an interesting question in the chat window about, how does one get into this, right? How does one get into the data protection field? And I think actually we're quite lucky in today's modern day and age in that there are courses and qualifications available. When I first started in the late 90s, it was all self-taught, right? There wasn't data protection wasn't a thing. If I said I did data protection around the dinner table, people would look at me and scratch their heads and not know what it was all about. But now privacy is a conversation that's around most dinner tables. And I think we've seen an associated rise in courses, and there are for technology and privacy by design courses available, and we're on a DPAS webinar. I should probably say go and have a look at the DPAS offerings. So yeah, just in answer to that question, for me personally, I didn't have the formal education, but I picked it up later. Yeah, I was an engineer in the army. I was a computer engineer in the army and had a legal background educationally. And I was lucky enough that somebody saw that on my CV and said, go away and learn about data protection. And I kind of went, all right. And fell in love, and I think that, not many people grow up. I used to say, oh, no one grows up wanting to be a data protection officer, but no, it's just something you fall into. But nowadays I find people studying privacy law at university, right? It's just like, it's the most amazing thing.
That's potentially fueled by now, as Kunbi touched on earlier on, it's something that we talk about in society more. Certainly when I was younger, I'd never heard of a data protection officer. That wasn't a thing that you didn't aspire to be. I was a maths teacher. But I think now, anyone that's seen things like The Social Dilemma on Netflix, I am yet to see it, but I keep getting told about there's a new episode in Black Mirror that apparently is fantastic.
Oh, it's superb. Yeah, it's about somebody who didn't read the terms and conditions and ends up having a Netflix show made about their life.
So all of these things, they're hitting a much younger crowd really than what privacy was 10 years ago, and so it's on people's minds. People are talking about it. They hear, it's in the news more regularly now that data's been breached, somebody's been hacked. This cyber crime's happened. I think it's now, because we live a more online life, it's more prevalent than ever. So I think there is probably people, to sort of go back to that question, Ralph, that you mentioned and answered. There is probably people younger than I am, maybe without the things written down on paper, but just because the world that we live in now actually have the knowledge that's probably transferable, because so many people have grown up using online platforms now and understand the implications of that.
Yes, thank you very much for that perspective. And someone has asked a question, and we've had this question asked twice, and that's in respect of whether there are any recommended information flow templates. I'm just going to give that a stab and then have, Ralph just say what you believe would respond to that. And I think that no, it all depends on what the specific structure of your organization is and what kinds of processing activities you undertake. That's what's going to determine, what kind of information flow template or, information flow map, so to speak, you require. If it's something you can do in Microsoft PowerPoint, or if it's something you're going to have to invest in a more thorough enterprise-grade privacy management platform for. So ultimately, that's my answer. I don't think that it's possible to, here just recommend any one template. And Ralph, do you agree with that?
This is where, as a consultant, you say available at reasonable rates, right? No. At the end of the day, there are plenty of solutions out there, both on the technological side. There are solutions out there that will allow you to data map and data flow. There are people that do it on Microsoft Word and Excel. There are people that do it on a whiteboard with a bit of paper. I mean, my best practice is always start with the individual. Always draw a little person or a little meeple up there to represent the individual. Start at the collection and then work it through to disposal. Literally follow the data from cradle to grave. And just sitting down and workshopping it out is often the best way. How you choose to record it is, neither here nor there. Essentially, you still need to do the groundwork of workshopping it out with the right stakeholders, and that probably means stakeholders from the business and the technologies, because whilst people in the business will know the data flow, it's the technologists who will know where the actual data might live physically or what vendors it might live in as well. So you probably need representation from both back end and front end.
Thank you very much, Ralph. And we have one last question here, which is essentially that given as organizations are implementing PETs, is there not going to be an expansion of the, attack vector, so to speak, on those organizations, such that there might be a risk that those PETs themselves could potentially be an avenue for those organizations to be targeted? And I think the answer is yes, but I'm just going to have Nat, just give us a view on that before we close.
I think it depends on what PETs you're going to use. If you start implementing some of the measures that we touched upon earlier on that are in the ICO's guidance, homomorphic encryption, no, that isn't going to be a threat to you. It does actually the entire opposite, the polar opposite. Of course, if you start implementing more sort of like software as a service, potentially opens up potentially more threats. But the idea of privacy enhancing technology is to eliminate or to reduce risk, not to increase it. So yeah, it'd be a pretty silly move on the development side if by implementing PETs we in turn increased our risk or opened up to ourselves to more threats.
I mean, no technology is 100% secure. Any sort of technology is going to have risk associated with it. Even the best encryption can be broken with enough resources, of course. All we're trying to do is create reasonable security measures that will, deter the casual attacker and have good responses for the more dedicated one, right? So PETs might be an attack vector, but equally they're going to be, vastly more benefit to those organizations who are trying to stop attack vectors at the end of the day. And I think, I think, if you're thinking about us and ourselves as privacy advisors, that means that we need to be familiar with these technologies and techniques going forwards to properly advise our clients and employers.
Thank you very much.
It's probably a good time to mention, I apologize, Kunbi, because I know we're about to run out of time, but really important to remember that some of these PETs actually require some expertise to implement. Yes, you are going to increase your risk if it's cobbled together by someone that doesn't really know what they're doing. So it's really important, if you're going down that quite advanced technology route, get somebody to do it that actually understands it. Don't do the YouTube video type approach. Just get somebody in that can explain.
Thank you very much, Nat. Now, on the subject of getting someone in there who knows what they're doing to implement your PET properly, here there's DPAS and privacy by design. And that's an overview of the sorts of services that Data Privacy Advisory Service can deliver to your organization to ensure you're implementing privacy by design effectively, safely, and to maximize the benefits for your organization and the security for the rights of the data subjects whose personal data you're processing. So whether that's compliance documentation, your policies, your procedures, whether it's audits or gap analysis to find what areas you could improve upon and how exactly you should do that. We are able to deliver that. And one of the main things in this webinar has been the importance of getting your staff members on board, everyone in the organization, and especially your management level staff, as well as those people who are going to be primarily responsible for processing personal data. So we have a lot of training programs and events that occur on a regular basis, and here are a few of them. If our nearest one is on the 5th of next month, and it's on CCTV. We have one the next day on data ethics. We have one on the BCS data protection practitioner, and we also have one on privacy by design specifically soon as well, where you're going to be taught by no other person than Ralph today, who you've clearly seen is an expert on the subject. So that's all for today. Thank you all very much for attending. Thank you to our panelists, very expert panelists, Nat and Ralph. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much to all attendees for your questions and participation as well. So we'll see you next time. Keep up with the DPAS LinkedIn page and our website for information about future webinars and events. So see you next time. Bye, everyone.